In May of 2026, the United States government reached a strange conclusion. It decided that a herd of bison in Montana had become too wild to be allowed on the land. Not too sick, not too dangerous, not too destructive, too wild. This is the story of how a single word, buried in a law written in 1934, was used to evict one of the most successful wildlife restoration projects in America, a nonprofit called American Prairie, and how that same word is now being aimed at 155 million acres of public land across the country. The word is livestock, and everything depends on what it's allowed to mean. Here's the situation the government created. On roughly 63,000 acres of public land in north-central Montana, bordering the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, a nonprofit called American Prairie had spent 20 years doing something almost nobody thought was still possible. It was rebuilding a wild bison herd on the northern Great Plains, the exact landscape where tens of millions of them once roamed before they were slaughtered to near extinction in the 1800s. By 2026, that herd numbered around 900 animals, grazing across a patchwork of private and public land, stitched together one ranch at a time. For most of those 20 years, the bison grazed on that public land under a federal permit, a permit the government issued, a permit the government defended in court for years. And then the government changed its mind about what the animals were, because here's the catch the entire story turns on. Under U.S. law, in almost every state, a bison is not wildlife. Legally, it's livestock, the same category as a cow. And a public land grazing permit, under that 1934 law, can only go to one specific kind of animal, livestock raised for production, for meat, for market. American Prairie's bison weren't being raised for any of that. They were being raised to be wild. To understand how an animal can be too wild to graze, you have to go back to 1934 and a law called the Taylor Grazing Act. Back then, the American West was an overgrazed mess. Ranchers ran cattle and sheep across the public domain with almost no rules, and the land was collapsing under the pressure. The Taylor Grazing Act was Congress's fix. It created a permit system. If you wanted to graze animals on federal land, you needed permission, and that permission came with limits, including a grazing fee, currently set at $1.35 per animal unit month, a number that hasn't changed much in decades and that ranching critics say amounts to a massive public subsidy. The whole point was to support the ranching economy while keeping the range from being destroyed, and that is the key. The law was written for one purpose: production agriculture. Permits were for domestic livestock raised to be sold, cattle headed for market, sheep raised for wool and meat. The entire framework assumes the animal on the land is a product moving through an economy. Now drop a wild bison herd into that framework and watch what happens. A bison, legally, is livestock in almost every state, lumped in with cattle, not recognized as wildlife the way a deer or an elk is. Only a handful of places, like Yellowstone, treat wild bison as wildlife. So American Prairie's bison were, on paper, livestock, but they weren't being raised for production. They were being restored as wild animals for conservation, which lands them in an impossible gap. Too legally livestock to count as protected wildlife, too genuinely wild to count as production livestock. An animal falling straight through a crack written 90 years before anyone thought to restore a wild herd on public land. And make no mistake, what American Prairie built was a real success, which is what makes the ending so strange. It started in 2001, when a conservation group set out to assemble something enormous on the northern Great Plains, a vast connected prairie reserve, on the scale the ecosystem actually needs. The method was patient and deliberately undramatic. Buy ranch land, but only from willing sellers, never by force. Combine each purchased ranch with the public land grazing leases already attached to it. Take down the interior fences and let the wildlife come back. The bison came back on a cold, rainy night in October of 2005. Just 16 animals trucked in from Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, stepping onto Montana prairie that hadn't held a wild herd in more than 120 years. years. From those 16, the herd grew, calf by calf, season by season, to around 900 animals. But here's the part most coverage skips. American Prairie didn't just build a herd, it became a source. Since 2005, it has sent more than 550 bison to native nations and conservation herds across the country, working through the Intertribal Buffalo Council, a network of tribes that signed the Buffalo Treaty in Browning, Montana in 2014, formally committing to restore wild bison across tribal lands as an act of both ecological and cultural sovereignty, specifically to strengthen the genetics of other herds. For many tribes, the return of the buffalo isn't only ecological, it's cultural and spiritual restoration, and a matter of food sovereignty. This one Montana project quietly seeded bison recovery far beyond its own fences. It's also worth remembering that bison aren't just another animal in the American story. In 2016, the National Bison Legacy Act made the American bison the official national mammal of the United States, a rare bipartisan moment of recognition that these animals belong to the national identity, not just to the ranching economy. Now, to be fair to the other side, American Prairie's bison aren't exactly feral. The organization tags them, vaccinates them, including testing for brucellosis, the livestock disease that has driven decades of bison management conflict in and around Yellowstone. Tests them for disease, donates the meat, and even runs a limited public hunt. Critics argued that made them functionally livestock. But the federal government looked at all of it and concluded the opposite, that these animals were managed at their core as wildlife for conservation. And that conclusion is what pulled the trigger. For a while, the system actually accommodated all of this. In July of 2022, under the Biden administration, the Bureau of Land Management approved American Prairie's request to graze bison instead of cattle on 7 allotments, about 63,000 acres, after years of environmental review. The agency found no significant harm to the land or the local ranching economy. Montana's ranching world pushed back hard, and it's worth understanding why, because this was never really about hating bison. To ranching families in Phillips County, this was about private property, rural economic survival, and a deep resentment of the idea that their land needed saving. That generations of stewardship could be swept aside by a conservation project buying up the neighborhood. In the town of Winifred, population barely 200, banners went up reading "Save the Cowboy, Stop American Prairie Reserve." 1 month after the 2022 approval, a private attorney filed a 53-page appeal against it. A self-described cowboy lawyer named Karen Budd-Falen, representing the Montana Stock Growers Association, and 2 local grazing districts, argued the permits violated the Taylor Grazing Act. That the law simply doesn't authorize grazing for non-production bison. That argument went nowhere for years. And then the administration changed. By 2026, Karen Budd-Falen was no longer an outside attorney. She had become the Associate Deputy Secretary of the Interior, the 3rd highest official in the very department that oversees the BLM. The Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, personally took jurisdiction over the American Prairie case. One of the revoked allotments, Flat Creek, appears on Budd-Falen's own disclosure as a former client. Interior says she recused herself and followed every ethics rule. Critics say the outcome speaks for itself, and the outcome was this. On May 8, 2026, the BLM revoked American Prairie's bison permits, reissued cattle-only permits, and set a deadline. The bison off public land by September 30, 2026. The reasoning in one sentence: because American Prairie manages its bison as wildlife rather than production livestock, the agency ruled it never had the authority to permit them at all. The success was the disqualification. Now, some perspective, because the scale matters in both directions. The disputed land is about 63,000 acres, a real loss, but a fraction of American Prairie's footprint of more than 600,000 acres. The bison aren't disappearing. On most of the reserve, they stay. And American Prairie is fighting. In June of 2026, it appealed the federal decision. Weeks later, on a separate front, a Montana judge handed the group a win, a preliminary injunction blocking the state from freezing bison grazing on state trust lands because officials had skipped the required public process. As the September deadline approaches, the outcome is genuinely unsettled. But the reason this story reaches far past one nonprofit cites in a document published on May 12, 2026. That day, the BLM proposed new grazing rules for roughly 155 million acres of public land. Rules that would formally define livestock to mean production-oriented animals only. The same word, the same argument used against American Prairie, written into policy for a landmass the size of Texas and California combined. If that definition holds, it doesn't just affect one herd in Montana. It reaches toward tribal buffalo restoration, toward conservation grazing everywhere on public land. A legal interpretation built to remove 900 bison could quietly redraw what's allowed to stand on the American commons. So it all comes back to that one word: livestock. For 20 years, American Prairie set out to prove that bison could be genuinely wild again, restored, self-sustaining, seeding herds across the country. By every measure it set for itself, it succeeded. And then a federal agency looked at that success and used it as the legal reason to take part of it away. Not because the animals were failing, because they had become, in the government's own words, too wild to qualify for the only permit that let them stay. The deadline is September 30th, 2026. The appeals are still moving. And the strangest question in American conservation right now is a simple one. What happens when you succeed at making something wild in a system that only has a box for things we own?